Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Achates Live on Tuesday, the 28th of July. I am Kane Moore. I am Director of Development at Achates Philanthropy, and I am your host for today's session. These sessions are brought to you by Achates Philanthropy. We are a creative consultancy with a holistic approach to strategy and to fundraising. We take our name from Greek and Roman mythology. Achates was the close friend and loyal advisor to Aeneas, and we think our name pretty neatly describes the relationship that we offer to the cultural sector. We set up Achates Live to support the sector, bringing cultural organisations together of all scale to discuss key topics and also to enable you to help each other. We don't have all the answers, but we do have an overview of the cultural sector, and we like to use that role in a supportive way. Our live streams started as a series of workshops in conjunction with the Old Vic back in London. COVID-19 closures means that we've moved the series online as we felt it was really important to continue our support of the sector through the challenges that the crisis has presented for all of us. Today's session, Capitalising Success, which marks the final and 10th session in our current season, focuses on capital fundraising and the additional challenges that the COVID-19 crisis has brought to campaigns. The session comes off the back of the government's announcement at the start of the month of £120 million of government funding as part of their £1.57 billion package to cultural, arts and heritage institutions. For today's session, I am delighted to introduce you to our fantastic panel of Stuart Hobley, Director of the Limbury Trust. Stuart, can you give me a wave and a hello? Oh, Stuart, are you still there? You need to unmute yourself.
No, you would think the number of Zoom meetings we've all been doing had to use a mute button. So I'm Stuart Hobley. I'm Director of the Limbury Trust. Nice to meet you all. Welcome to my attic.
Also, Joe Bussey, who is Associate Director of Development at the Science Museum Group. Joe, do you want to introduce yourself and introduce you to your space?
Yes, certainly. Afternoon, everyone. I'm Jo Bussey, Associate Director of Development at the Science Museum Group, and I'm currently in my nephew's bedroom as I'm in between moving houses. So slightly different space for me at the moment. Thanks, Kim.
We also have Nick Greatrex, who is Corporate Partnership Manager of National Railway Museum York. Nick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nick. I work for the National Railway Museum in York in our corporate partnerships team, and I'm currently in an empty bedroom because I'm also moving house this weekend.
It's clearly the time to move house. And finally, last but not least, we have Chris Gribble, who is Chief Executive of the National Centre for Writing. Chris, can you give us a hello?
Hi there, very good to be here. I'm not moving house. I am about to go and spend 3 days in a yurt, which I think is probably as stressful, but it's really great to be here.
How funny. Are you going straight to the yurt after the
Directly,
session?
Absolutely directly.
It won't take up too much of your time. Chris is actually wearing 2 hats today, as he will also be delivering our Achates Philanthropy Prize Golden Nugget later in the session. We have our colleague Tash hosting the chat today and fielding your questions. Please do say hello to her and add your questions and opinions to the conversation, and we'll take some of your questions later in the session. Just a reminder, all information is current as of 28th of July. So if you are watching this at a later date, please do bear this in mind as responses are changing as the situation, particularly around COVID-19, continues to develop. Okay, introduction over. I am now delighted to hand over to Achates Philanthropy's brilliant director, Caroline McCormick, who is chairing today's session. Caroline, over to you.
Hi, thanks so much, and welcome again to all our panelists. Big particular thanks to Chris today, who is not only doing our golden nugget for the Achates Philanthropy Prize, he stepped into the panel as, very sadly, Esther McLaughlin of Royal Academy of Dance is unable to join us through ill health. We send our very best wishes to Esther, who is leading the capital project for the relocation of Royal Academy of Dance. And a special thanks to Chris, because he's also meant to be on holiday this week. So it's really kind of you to take the time to join us, Chris. Thank you again. So I always start these sessions by trying to pay tribute to a group of people. And this week we thought it was really particularly appropriate that we pay tribute both to those who are starting to return to work in the cultural sector and also those who won't be returning to work at this time. And we're really thinking of you all as you face the challenges ahead. So, capitalising success. It's a project area that's really close to my heart. In 1997, goodness me, I think I started work on my first cultural sector capital project as head of trust fundraising at the National Theatre. The target was 48 million at the time, and we had a £40 million grant from Arts Council England, and we never completed the campaign. I learned a lot from that early project that we still use in Achates today. Developing front of house first, which was the strategy, meant that the focus was the idea that the public would really give their support to the sexy area of rear of house. But the fact was that as soon as we'd broken ground and the audiences had more comfy seats, we stopped being able to raise money. You can imagine that knowledge was put to work when I went back to the National Theatre nearly 25 years later to start work on the National Theatre NT Future campaign, sitting in almost the same seat and reliving the beauty of Dennis Lasden's masterpiece for the second time. When I heard that enabling works were planned for the project, I insisted that we put hoardings around them so that no one would think we'd broken ground and the same situation wouldn't arise again. In the time since that project, I've led and advised on capital projects of all sizes and scales and art forms, from the £70 million Darwin Centre campaign at the Natural History Museum, where I was development director for 5 years, to the relocation of Garsington Opera, the development of Dance East, to very proudly for me, the creation of the National Centre for Writing, where I support Chris as a trustee today. And we have more than 20 capital projects of all scales across the country in our portfolio in Achates today. In this time, the nature of capital projects has revolutionised. No project is just a reinvention of a building, a refurbishment of a building today. I would argue that capital projects represent a reinvention of an organisation with a building developed to suit that enhanced focus and purpose. It's also become critical at a time when it is clear that philanthropy will not alone fill the gap left by state funding, and the need for what ACE refers to as dynamism is even more challenging without the asset of a building to lever. At Achates, as a strategy and fundraising company, people ask us to support them at moments of change, of which capital projects represents one such moment. So we're fortunate enough to have, as Kane has said, something of a national snapshot of organisational aspirations and dreams for the sector. We see clear trends regarding how much money it's possible for an organisation not of national status to raise, how individual giving is not only poorly distributed, it is in some locations and art forms entirely inaccessible, which can dictate in advance what it's possible to achieve. COVID has added another dimension again to these factors, as the need for survival has taken over everything, and supporters of all kinds have had to consider their priorities. And I'm really looking forward to discussing with all our panelists how COVID has influenced them, their policies and approach. Today, we are lucky enough to have a panel of individuals in the middle of capital projects, the director of one of our leading foundations, and a veteran of a capital project for the only art form where individual philanthropy is actually in decline. So it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome you all as well. And I'd like to go first of all to Jo Bussey, and then who is Associate Director of Development at the Science Museum Group, and then to her colleague, Nick Greatrex, who's Corporate Partnerships Manager of National Railway Museum in York. Jo, I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit about the projects that were in your portfolio at the Science Museum Group, what continues, what's been lost, and some key considerations for you, if you would. And then Nick, I know she'll pass to you.
Lovely, thanks very much for that, Caroline. So I think, yeah, obviously it's been a very difficult time for everyone over the past few months. Across the Science Museum group, what most people aren't aware of is they're very familiar with the Science Museum in London, but we actually have 5 museums within our portfolio across the group. So we also have Locomotion in Shildon in the northeast of England, the National Railway Museum in York, and the 2 venues where I oversee fundraising teams are actually the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester and the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford. So the area that I'm going to go into more detail about today is specific to the Power Hall Capital project at the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester. There have been a number of issues with the project over the past few months. I thought it'd be quite useful for people to hear some of the things that me and my team have been putting into place to overcome those issues. And then Nick is going to add to that with a few new things that have been happening at the National Railway Museum in York. So just to tell you a little bit about the Power Hall project. So the Power Hall is a Grade 2 listed building. It's currently undergoing a multi-million-pound restoration, which includes major repairs to the roof, a redisplay of the engine collection, and a new gallery and interpretation. So in March 2020, thanks to DCMS funding, work was underway to replace the roof. We had a number of prospects drawn up, and we had our case for support developed, and we knew which direction we were going into. And then a global pandemic hit. So what did we do as a result of that? Well, there were a number of different areas that myself and my team looked at. The first of those was actually, like many other cultural organisations at the time, our attention needed to look more at our urgent fundraising need. So the Power Hall project was then paused. But this pause actually provided quite a nice opportunity for us, and it allowed us the time to look much more closely at our revenue and our capital fundraising together and look at our prospects in a much more cohesive way. So instead of trying to pigeonhole people into the box that we thought they should be fitting, it actually gave us a little bit of time to look at more detail as to where some of those potential donors and supporters could actually engage with us. And it really made us ask, how could we engage our donors in a much more integrated way, not only across the capital projects and Power Hall, but also from our festivals and our education and our exhibition programme perspective. So in addition to asking how our capital and revenue fundraising could integrate better, the second thing that we did was look at how we could maintain and develop our existing partnerships with donors. So we were fortunate that across the Science Museum group at the start of lockdown, our fabulous IT team introduced Microsoft Teams for everyone. Once that was installed across all of the staff team, it meant that that system could be used to actually engage with some of our donors and really progress some of our existing partnerships. So we've had quite a broad range of calls and updates from everything from our local authority partners to our trusts and corporate partners. So introducing that system has actually really provided a really nice opportunity to have quite detailed conversations that really go into everything across all of our programme areas. And similarly, to talk not only about what financial support people can give us, but also looking much more broadly at gifts in kind, how people could help us with the marketing side of things, or even volunteering in the future once our museums start to reopen. So that was a second area that myself and my team looked at. And finally, one area that I focused on was just asking myself the question, well, is there anything else internally that we could do differently? So the world has changed, everything was very different from how it was a few months ago. So how could we work in a different way to actually promote the Power Hall project and really get people involved with it? So 2 key areas I looked at were actually at the Science Museum Group's Foundation Board. So the majority of our trustees obviously are London-based and naturally focus a lot of their attention on the Science Museum in London. But with everyone working from home, we had that really nice opportunity to engage in much more detail with some of our trustees about the Power Hall project and discuss what opportunities they saw to engage with their own contacts and networks. And that's really starting to generate some new leads and some new fundraising opportunities for us. And the final area I looked at internally was actually the marketing of Power Hall as a capital project. So at the time that our museums closed, our marketing team were about to update our branding of the Revolution Manchester Gallery. And our closure period has really provided a nice opportunity for development and marketing to work much more closely together to integrate the Power Hall as a capital project within that larger Revolution Manchester branding and campaign work, just to really have greater continuity across our fundraising messages that are going out. And people will start to see that over the coming weeks. So these are just a few ways in which we've refocused and overcome some of the difficulties that we've experienced over the past few months. And I'm just going to hand you over to my colleague, Nick Greatex now, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the capital project at the National Railway Museum.
Thanks for that, Jo. Yeah, we have quite a large capital project underway at the National Railway Museum, which is called Vision 2025. It coincides with the 50th anniversary of our museum, the Railway Museum, but also coincidentally with the 200th anniversary of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which is basically ran alongside our sister museum in locomotion. So the capital project basically has 9 separate areas within the fundraising, which also is within locomotion. I was really going to mention just 2 of these, which we're spending more time focusing on, but one of them is we're building a brand new central hall. I don't know if anyone's been to National Railway Museum, but basically we have a road running through the middle of the site. So we have a tunnel where people have to get from one side to the other. So we're building a new central hall in there. And also we're bringing a Wonder Lab to the National Railway Museum. We have one at the Science Museum in London, which is hugely successful, and also one in Bradford. We're bringing one to York as well, which is a hands-on activity zone for 7 to 14-year-olds. Our one will be similar to the one in London, but it'll obviously have a link to rail to really fit within the surroundings. As Caroline mentioned at the start, what we're doing with Vision 2025 is basically a huge redevelopment, but also repositioning the museum. Our sort of mission is to become the world's railway museum. And we think we tell a lot of stories of the past and the present, but we don't tell too much of the future. So we think by bringing all those areas together, we really can inspire young people, inspire them into careers in rail and, you know, the potential of what they could do in the future, and that we could be the central sort of point to that within the rail industry. With regard to the fundraising so far, it's a 55.3 million campaign. Fortunately, in October last year, we were given 18.5 million from the government towards this, which has really helped to sort of, I think, put in people's eyes that this is happening. So we were very successful there. The museum's located directly behind the railway station, and there's also a huge redevelopment project about to go underway in York called York Central. It's the largest brownfield site in Europe, and we're basically the gateway to this huge new regeneration project, which is fantastic. I mean, we'll basically be the cultural hub to the whole site. Within our team, I mean, we're quite a small team, but there's 2 of us who work in corporate partnerships. And I thought it might be worth I just mention a little bit about what we've been doing over the last 7 or 8 months, sort of pre-lockdown and throughout lockdown, just to sort of explain how we've been quite successful in a period which obviously has been very difficult. But just before lockdown, we started organising some breakfast get-togethers of industry. The idea behind these really was to give some sort of early input into our plans for Wonder Lab and Central Hall, so we could engage with corporates by saying, this is what we're thinking of doing. What do you think about this? What would you like to see in there? And I think it gave them a sort of bit of input into it, so they thought that they were being consulted to some extent within the plans. We ran a couple, I think it's probably late February, very successfully with real interest. But we also had quite a few more booked into March. And obviously, overnight, we were told almost the museum was closed, and there was a panic about what should we do with these activities. So we took the decision, let's just do them online. It's basically an online presentation anyway. Instead of sitting around a table, let's just do this through Microsoft Teams. I think there was a little bit of, oh, can we do that initially? And the reaction was, you know, would it work? Would it have the same input? But we ran the first 2, had great feedback, great engagement with corporates. And I think what it almost did was gave us access, widened our reach to a lot of people who'd struggle to get to the museum to come and meet with us and be able to show around. but with everyone sort of working from home, it was a really great opportunity. So we ran a few webinars with corporates. Then follow on from that, we created more content throughout lockdown. So we had STEM ambassador webinars explaining how businesses could get involved with the STEM ambassador scheme. We had some family events where, surprisingly, we had CEOs of corporate organizations with their small children online doing hands-on activities, which again, I think it was a different environment to be able to engage with people at the level that we really wanted to engage with. We also ran a railway quiz. Again, we thought this might have 5, 6, 7 people interested in getting involved. We ended up with 95 people on the call. So it was a fun quiz, but again, it was a really great engagement tool to speak to people that we probably wouldn't usually. And we sort of finished this with, we had a webinar last week with the Rail Minister, Chris Heaton-Harris, who joined us, which was really good because we got the exact level of people we wanted around the table. They had exclusive access to ask whatever questions they wanted to him. And the fact that we were hosting it, I think, really put us in the eyes of a lot of people that maybe weren't previously. So I think in conclusion, just to summarize, I think the one thing we did was adapt really quickly to change. And I think we were very ahead of the game, I think. And I think it's gone down very well within the museum that we realized it was a good opportunity to do this. So I think we adapted quickly. We've definitely built new relationships, and we've definitely engaged with people that we probably wouldn't have done previously. And I think on the other side of things as well, we've actually helped some parents entertain their kids during this. So I think that went down quite well also. So I think just we've tried to do things a little bit differently, and I think we've been quite successful. So I think in a nutshell, that's what we've been up to.
Fantastic. And thank you both, Joe and Nick. That's such an interesting insight to an absolutely live capital project. You've said a number of things that chime with me there, from a combined approach to fundraising, a holistic approach to audiences, and repositioning your organisation. Absolutely the word you were using there, Nick, which was involve, which I think is too often overlooked. On that note, I'd really like to move to Stuart, if I may. Stuart, could you just introduce yourself and perhaps give us an overview of Limbury Trust's perhaps evolving role and relationship to capital projects, perhaps why the foundation considers these important, and maybe even what you're looking for in projects that you look to? Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah. Certainly. So I'm Stuart Hobley, Director of the Limbury Trust. I joined the Limbury Trust just before Christmas, and prior to that I worked for Heritage Lottery Fund, or National Lottery Heritage Fund as it is now known, which we all have to learn to say. And prior to that I was involved with capital fundraising myself, so I've sort of been the other side of the fence, as it were, in terms of developing and delivering capital projects. And I know that they are, and certainly in my experience of fundraising, the hardest projects and the greediest projects that you'll ever be involved with. And if writing the bids is hard, actually delivering the projects becomes another piece of work in itself. So I fully appreciate the breadth and depth that you have to go into to convince people to shell out for capital projects. And I think Limbury is one of those funders which is known for some very, very big multi-million-pound projects. But I think what people don't necessarily know is the majority of our capital projects are actually under 100K. They're for smaller local projects. Often we're coming in at the end of a fundraising appeal and helping to complete that. So things like the Reading Rep Theatre, for example, or Luton Hat Works, which has just been announced today. They're projects where we're kind of a partner with a number of other funders, and we've kind of come in towards the end to help really complete that fundraising. This year we've decided not to fund any substantial capital projects, and by substantial I do mean the kind of over £500,000 million projects. So where we are doing capital, it really is at the moment coming in at the end and helping sort of support existing appeals to complete, and that is very much driven by the COVID situation, which we've already heard a bit about, and just trying to ensure that we can support as many projects as we can. But when we do support capital projects, I guess the things that we really look for, I think first and foremost, is understanding the story that you're telling, because we want to be as excited about it as you are, because capital projects are amazing, they are transformative, they do exceptional things in terms of organizational sustainability, reaching out to new communities, and they can completely change an organization. So for us, we want to be, on that same page as you. And within that, there's quite a number of things we'll look at. We look a lot at governance of organisations when they come forward. Are you reflective of the community voice that you're wanting to serve? We look at things like skills audits. When was the last time your organisation did a skills audit? That's a big question we ask when people are doing capital projects. Do you have the skills on board to help take a capital project through? Because irrespective of the size, you'll be a very different organisation by the end of it, by the point at which you start. And I think it's important for us that organisations understand that when they embark on that journey. We're very interested in impact and reach and the difference the project's going to make. It's the kind of the who cares question, really. Who cares about this project other than you? Because the reality for a lot of funders is everybody comes to see us and says their project is the most important. So how do you then, when you've got this kind of portfolio of important projects, decide between them? Accessibility is really important. There's been a lot of talk over the last couple of weeks about changing places facilities, which is great, seeing those embedded within capital projects. But we certainly want to see people go further and actually properly embed a really holistic approach to access and barriers throughout their capital project. And I think the final thing is really about strategy and need. You know, what is the context in which your project sits? That's a really important thing because it levers in different partners. It might lever in different audiences that you've not worked for, who you've not been involved with before. So understanding the kind of ecosystem you're living in is really important to us as a funder.
Thank you, Stuart. That's such a brilliant overview in a very short space of time of the rigour of the work that you do. And I know that you bring a tremendous oversight yourself from your work at the National Lottery Heritage Fund as well. And it's fascinating. At Achates, we always talk about how when you're carrying out a capital project, you're really opening up your house and inviting the world in. And I think you've just given us a very good insight into the things that you're looking for as somebody being invited into that house. So thank you. Chris, I'd love to turn to you if I may now. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, about the development of the National Centre for Writing and the journey that really you went on over a number of years, because I think it will pick up on a number of things that Stuart mentioned there.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. I think about 4 times I suddenly thought, during when Stuart was speaking, I was thinking, yep, tick, that one. Particularly that kind of notion of you'll be a different organisation at the end of the process than you were at the start. It's very true. And I'll come back to that later. So the National Centre for Writing at Dragon Hall in Norwich, I suppose has been the culmination of a 10 or 11-year journey. We started, the project was sort of conceived in its first phase back in 2008-9, I think. And it was a kind of part of an evolving story between, we're a relatively young organisation. We were only founded in 2004-5. Or 2002-3, I should say, very first, but we were kind of a partnership organisation from the start. Everything that we did was in partnership, and we had some really strong relationships with our University of East Anglia, where the world famous Creative Writing School is, with our city council and local kind of county council with the Arts Council and those partners. And there was a real sense of kind of urgency about their ambition for us, and that transmitted itself to us. And we wanted to explore the ambitions that we had for our art form, for our organisation, for our city and our county, and where we sat, what we thought we could do with the art form that we had. This kind of took place against the background of understanding that we had a range of challenges that faced both our art form of literature, and that expands to encompass creative writing, literary translation and reading. We had challenges in terms of the notion of teaching and learning and what literature and creative writing was, where it sat, who owned it, who kind of controlled it. And also around our place, Norwich. There's a lot of interesting challenges around Norwich. Where was Norwich, for example, was a question that I've been asked several times. And indeed at one London party, someone said, oh, do they read in Norwich? How marvellous. I think they were joking. I think so, anyway. I'm not 100% certain. But there were some challenges there which kind of taken together led to an opportunity. And we identified a key driving force of that opportunity as we wanted with our partners to really put Norwich on the world map for the strength around creative writing that existed in our historical context and our contemporary culture. The UNESCO Cities of Literature programme, the UNESCO Created Cities programme, in which literature as one designation, offered the opportunity for us to do that. So we began a 3 or 4 year campaign to become England's first UNESCO City of Literature, which took 3.5 years and a lot of frustration to bring to fruition, but it did so in 2012. And at the heart of that campaign was the opportunity, or was the commitment, to build somewhere, to make a physical space for the broad, the exhilarating, the inclusive art form that reading, writing and creative writing and literary translation is. So that's what we did in 2012. We made a commitment to put a physical place in together that would showcase the strengths of the city, provide a place for people to come together, provide a place for experimentation, engagement and involvement of the communities both around us physically and digitally. And we went out and told stories for 3, 4, 5 years in order to make that a reality. We told a story about how our art form was so powerful, yet had very little national presence in terms of an organisation representing it. We told a story about how liberational and transformational on a personal level creative writing was, how literary translation moved stories around the world, broadened horizons, opened minds, broke down barriers, and was a powerful tool in a whole range of well-being and educational, aspirational development opportunities. And we told a story about Norwich as a place which had 700 years history of radical social transformation through literature, from Julian of Norwich, who was the first woman published in book form, the first woman to acknowledge God as a mother, the first woman to sit in an anchorite cell 10 yards away from where I'm sitting now and speak to some of the most powerful people in medieval England on a road from Norwich to London. And we took that story out and we said, we can do that. We can make a place which is transformational, which is revolutionary, which showcases the broadest possible power that creative writing and reading and literary translation has. And also, it doesn't have to be London. It doesn't have to be in one of the UK's major core cities. We can do that here with our partnerships, with the communities that we have and with the ideas and the imagination that we have. And we did that. And we didn't take a straight route to it. We started off with one building in mind and ended up in a very different one. We've ended up in a beautiful Grade 1 medieval hall house that we've added a new wing to, an education space, a cottage for writers and translators, a 120-seat venue, 3 rooms for writers, and a community space and a garden. And now we're starting a new story, thanks to C19 and what's happened recently. We're getting a chance to pause at the end of, we thought we'd come to the end of a chapter, and we now realise it's literally just the start of a whole new set of narratives that we're starting to think about what we can do now for the audiences around us, what has changed for them, what interesting opportunities can we develop and achieve together that we didn't even imagine that we'd have to strive for less than 6 months ago.
Thank you, Chris. And it has been completely fascinating and a privilege to watch the organisation evolve into one that has always cared about art form, people and play, into one which is embedded in its community and vital to the heart of the city. So many congratulations on all you've achieved there. I'd like to put a couple of questions to our panellists, if I may, before I open the floor to questions from the chat. Joe and Nick, I'd love to start with you, if I may. At a time when we're closely focused on the needs of our audiences, do you think capital campaigns are still a priority? And if so, how do we weigh and communicate organisational sustainability and value at this time?
Shall I start, Nick, with that one?
Yeah, you go, Joe.
Yeah, I think obviously in terms of capital projects, they're absolutely vital. I think possibly more so at this point in time due to the issues that a number of cultural partners are facing. I think, again, it's about that step change and it's about organisational development. So it is all about the future. But I think what people forget is obviously that capital project is there in terms of the physical build for only a defined period of time, but it's about what that capital project then opens up in terms of the longer term. And for me, some of the key themes that we're looking at is the learning opportunities and our education opportunities. So not just formal learning, but informal learning, and how to actually continue to attract and engage new audiences. And for that, a Power Hall is a vital part of that development.
Super. Nick, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're slightly, I suppose, being a railway museum, I suppose listening to industry, and you can see the huge skills shortage that there is already and there's going to be. And then you've got projects such as HS2 looking for tens of thousands of people to work there as well. No, I mean, York still is a railway city, but it's a difficult career to entice young people into. I think we've got a real opportunity within Vision 2025 to be seen as, being a real support to the industry and being able to inspire young people and give them the chance to see rail as a career. I think it's been a struggle previously, and speaking to many of the partners we work with already, they still think it's not the sexiest of roles, to put it in that sort of, people don't see that there is huge opportunities. And I think, you know, speaking to industry, they need someone to work alongside them to get young people interested. And I think, yes, it's a huge investment, but I think it's something which is really needed. And going into the future, there's going to be such a requirement for roles that we can really help with it. So I think having a Wonder Lab, seeing new things within the museum, exciting future technologies will get young people engaged. So I think we've got a real role to play within that.
And what's clear from both your answers is that you see your museums as living museums, as a part of the future of the nation, the particularly young people. Stuart, I'd love to turn to you if I may. Obviously, trusts and foundations have got a number of challenges at this time. And in fact, trusts and foundations are one of the groups that we paid tribute to early on, because we think the response has been tremendous and very nimble. But it can't be easy balancing these different factors together.
No, it's not. And I think sort of COVID has really brought up a lot of issues, I think, for capital projects going forward, in terms of how you plan them, how you develop them, even if a capital project is actually now the answer. I mean, I think there are lots of questions, particularly people who are in the early days of thinking about a new capital profile. Actually, is doing a capital project the best way of reaching that solution? Capital projects do incredibly transformative things, but we've seen some incredibly transformative approaches during the last 3 or 4 months as well, in terms of how people have reached out to audiences, how they've invested in digital infrastructure, how they've invested in revenue and programming. So I think for funders going forward with capital projects, I think we really, that kind of need and why now, and how this capital project will really be a sort of a transforming influence is going to become increasingly critical. And really just understanding how people are planning for the future. It's very easy to get locked into a kind of short-term approach in terms of planning around COVID, in terms of how you mitigate for those immediate issues, but actually at some point those will relax and some point they will go. So what does that longer-term project look like?
And that brings us very neatly back, thank you, Stuart, back to some of the points that Chris was making, which is that keen understanding about people and purpose and how that drives you forward into the next stage. Chris, looking back and reflecting on the experience of having developed the National Centre for Writing, you're very happily now resident in the building and it's been open for a year. Tell us a bit about the things that you would bring to that experience with COVID as a sort of lens.
Gosh, well, we've been open now 2 years, which still shocks me.
Sorry.
I think no, it's fine. I was writing that this morning, and I thought, yes, it is 2 years almost exactly to the within a week or so. So I think if I'd known what was going to happen, I think I would have looked at designing entrance points for communities and audiences much earlier into our process, even before we started the building work. We effectively squatted in this building for 2.5 years before we started kind of the capital program and the new build. And I think I would have used that. I would have been less scared about learning about a grade 1 listed building and keener to bring people in much more quickly. And I think that I would have kind of realized that our stories for our capital campaign needed to change quite quickly after we opened, and that we couldn't keep to the same stories. We had to kind of change those more radically when we learned what it was like to run and open as a building, as a place in the real physical city and in the virtual world. I think I would have programmed in, should I say, a more thoroughgoing strategic review earlier after opening, rather than just lying on the floor panting for 3 months.
I think it's a perfectly normal reaction and completely understood. I'd love to just switch focus a little bit and ask you all about the importance of capital projects at this time, where obviously we're seeing the economics of our organisations change very quickly. I've just completed with Bot Consulting 6 years of evaluating the Catalyst and Catalyst Evolve programme, and literally having handed in the report at a moment where income generation is, of course, one of the areas of vulnerability for so many organisations. Obviously, Arts Council has a focus on the word I can't say, dynamism, in its new strategy. Can I ask you all a bit about that focus, the emphasis on earned income, and how you're seeing that in a post-capital age, a post-COVID age. Joe and Nick, shall I turn to you first?
Yes, certainly. I think obviously in terms of broader income generation, I think what we're all experiencing is a significant loss of income across a number of different income areas. But where capital projects can help to facilitate that is looking at those new income opportunities going forward. So that's everything from, you know, exhibition income to, you know, catering income to, you know, sort of like conference and events and higher income. So I think capital projects have a huge role to play in terms of helping to actually look at long-term sustainability and long-term recovery from the current financial position that many organisations are facing.
Super. Nick, do you want to add to that at all?
No, I mean, I think that's, yeah, what Joe said is true. I think, yeah, there's importance. I mean, we have a lot of corporate space at the museum, which again will be part of the redevelopment. And I think there is the need for good quality corporate space, and there is real income potential to be made from that. When the museum's planning to reopen next week, so there is, I think, one thing which we've come across already, just in the plans of reopening, is that it's ticketed initially with only certain areas of the museum being open. But I think it's the first time that we've made an ask when people have booked tickets to donate at the same time, and it's been very successful. So I think it's in people's heads and minds that there is huge financial implications, and are prepared to, you know, put some money in, because we are free obviously to visit, but people are already prepared to support us. And I think yeah, it's going to be a struggle. It's going to be difficult for everybody. But I think there is a real importance of a capital project still, because I think we really can be make a transformation to the city as well here in York through our regeneration.
Yeah, it's a great point, Nick. Stuart, very quickly turning to you, dynamism, and the emphasis on that. How much are you looking at that question? Because we know, for example, that entrepreneurial activity often relies on having a building to enable that.
Yeah. Well, I think we look at it through a number of different ways, really. I mean, capital projects can very quickly become the mission of the organisation, and I think that's a dangerous road to go down, because they should support your mission overall. And these projects don't exist in isolation. So those partnerships you bring on board, how you're working with your local community, how you're empowering them to kind of convince us to fund your project, that's the kind of thing we're looking for. And I think dynamism can come in many different ways that impact on that kind of bottom line sort of business planning. I mentioned governance earlier on. Again, that's something that I think is really critical to having good business planning and good longer term thinking, but also environmental impact. And us, like many other funders, now expect organisations to really think about the environmental impact of their capital project. And even if it means it's going to cost more money up front, that doesn't mean to say it's bad value for money. It's not. Value for money doesn't mean doing something cheaply. It means what are those cost savings longer term? What can you build in from the start, which means you actually have a kind of a lower operating cost going forward.
Absolutely, and direct cost and indirect cost. Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Chris, you corrected me and reminded me that you've been in your building for 2 years now. How are you living in it, and how are you finding your dynamic approach evolving?
I think that kind of going back to something that you said at the start, when you kind of noted that capital projects are reorganization or reinventions of organizations, and the building follows that. I think that what is kind of I'd add to that is that both the capital project and what C19 is now doing, which effectively is accelerating a whole host of changes that were already apparent in some way or other, but kind of really bringing them forward. It's reinventing the partnership around the capital project. In the Arts Council terms, we are examples. Capital projects, if they work or they're done well, are examples of cultural compacts. They are partnerships to drive change in a place for certain benefits. And what we're seeing now is kind of just a resetting of that compact with a different set of outcomes and priorities. And if the partnerships are working, or if they're functioning and kind of positive, then I feel really good. Ours are, I'm really pleased to say, then we feel confident that we can answer the changed context, and that compact will help us deliver the changes that are now needed that we didn't know about.
Thank you, Chris. That's great and really interesting to hear about that evolution. Kane, have we got some questions from the chat that you'd like to put to the panel?
We've had, I'd say less questions, more sort of observations. So we have a few people who have very live capital projects, which in one way or another have been affected by COVID-19. So we've been hearing from Liz from Cambridge Junction, who is working with Cambridge City Council on a capital campaign, which has just been put on hold. And we've also heard from Abby from University Arts London and how their timeframe around London College of Fashion campus has been affected. And then finally, the challenges that Kirsty and the Citizens Theatre in Glasgow have had with raising that final £1.5 million for their capital campaign. I guess a really interesting point came out of the chat with Liz at Cambridge Junction of just how there's really seems to be a regional and city variation going on between those councils who are seeing their capital campaigns being part of their city or town's recovery and those who don't. And I just wondered whether, you know, any of the panel had sort of any experience that they could draw on there.
Joe, do you want to pick that up initially? Because I'm very interested because you have an interesting mix of projects in different locations.
Yeah, I think I'll start particularly with Manchester. So in terms of Greater Manchester Combined Authority, obviously Manchester is still in quite a large phase of development. So in terms of Power Hall and even our special exhibition gallery, which was our earlier capital project, which is just about to complete, both of those projects have really been looked at in the context of other developments happening in the city. So really what we're trying to do is create, you know, a combined cultural quarter around us. So we have neighbouring cultural partners, there are other developments and other land within the City Council's ownership, as well as the Greater Manchester Combined Authority's ownership. So it's really looking at that whole section of the city and looking to see how can everybody work together to actually improve, you know, all of those particular buildings and make everything to a certain standard. But within a broader context, it's about supporting the economic regeneration of the whole city and the wider, you know, employability and long-term development as well.
It's been fascinating to see how the Metro mayors have really changed the landscape of their cities. We were just talking to National Museums Liverpool this morning, weren't we, Kane, about the implication of their mayor, and it is really impressive to see what's happening in Manchester. Nick, do you want to add anything quickly to that?
No, I mean, we have a, you know, an excellent relationship with the City of York Council because we're partners in the York Central development. So the huge brownfield site around us is with Network Rail and a lot of the land, Homes England, ourselves and the council. So we've got a real good reason to work closely together because this is all about job creation and regeneration of the city, housing in the city, affordable housing in the city, and also having a great cultural institution right in the middle of this huge site. So yeah, I mean, we have to have a great relationship with the council because this is, you know, the future of the city, really.
Absolutely. And Stuart, you must have a fascinating macro picture nationally of the variations and how these different local government institutions are really changing the landscape.
Yeah, and certainly when I worked at the lottery, we would spend a lot of our time sort of having conversations with local authorities, particularly about their investment in culture. And, you know, for any funder, that kind of partnership is incredibly attractive because it really helps to kind of underline questions around sustainability and longevity and actually what the project's going to do in terms of contributing to the economy as a whole. I think there are also lots of questions about that kind of community partnership level and what organisations are really doing to say we are reflective of the society in which we live. I've seen some really great work recently with a museum in Suffolk who were opening up their gardens for people to use during COVID for many people who live nearby that didn't have any access to green space. There's a theatre I'm aware of that operated as a food bank. I mean, people are really, you know, drawing on those kind of community threads that they've been developing for years and years to demonstrate their importance during this time. So I think at both ends, that's kind of what funders are looking for, is that big strategic overarching muscle, particularly when you're asking for millions and millions of pounds. But I think at the other end of the scale, it is how the community champion you and see you as vital to their modern life.
It's lovely to hear you say that, Stuart, and not least because the Achates Philanthropy Prize, which we launched 5 years ago, which has always been about celebrating supporters of the cultural sector and encouraging anyone to be a cultural philanthropist. This year, we're pivoting and really trying to showcase 15 examples in each region of the UK and showcase different examples of how the cultural sector has driven value and created value alongside economic value, not just economic value alone, which is, I think, where so much emphasis is given at this present time. And with that beautiful segue, Chris, having mentioned the Achates Philanthropy Prize, may we turn to you for this week's Achates Philanthropy Prize Golden Nugget, the last of the season. A few words of wisdom that will perhaps help us all reflect and gather together some thoughts on what we've heard today from speakers. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. That's a tall order. Thank you, everyone who's spoken today. I think that one of the really useful reminders of today is that whatever kind of the challenges that your project is going through, there's one certainty, and that is there will be people who have been in your situation or one very like it. So my major kind of piece of learning from doing the Capital project was to ask for help early and often, and repeatedly if needs be, because there were always great people around to help you. I was flattered and anxious in equal measure when Caroline kindly asked me to deliver this golden nugget today. Flattered because although it is 2 years since we formally opened NCW at Dragon Hall, the novelty of its reality still hasn't worn off, and I'm not 100% certain that I'm sure that I know what I've learned, if that grammar makes sense. I was anxious because our project was, I felt, relatively small, was unique, embedded in our organisational journey and our city's history and our communities and partners' interests and our sector development. I quickly realised on reflection that the latter situation, the uniqueness of our project, is the case for every single project that happens, capital project in the arts. In terms of the former situation, well, I think the realisation that our building and our organisation, as Stuart mentioned, wasn't the same one that we had on our hands even as long ago as 2 years when we opened the doors, led me to what might pass as a golden nugget. It probably more accurately described as a story, which is unsurprising given where I come from in my artistic background. So what strikes me most forcibly about what we went through, whether that was the inception, the feasibility or the plausibility stage, the fundraising, the design, the delivery, the finishing, was the fact that as a project, as a building, as a venture and an adventure, it existed and continues to exist in a state of dynamic tension between two poles. Firstly, there is the public or the civic pole. This is the place where your project exists as an imaginary set of stories in the minds of your partners, audiences, funders, stakeholders, and communities. It's a place of potential, of shared understanding, and it's a place that can be reached when you ask yourself, what does the building mean? What does it or could it mean? What could it promise or even threaten when you set free that story into the world? Who wants your project to happen and why? Who can see the possibilities for your place, for the communities it aims to serve, the economy of that place, and more widely, your art form, your artists and the practitioners? Who wants to join in and help? And who's anxious about it and who might want to stop it? Who's worried about what is being lost as well as what is being gained? Who feels like they're going to be left behind? Secondly, there's the private or the organisational pole. This is the place where you're required to tell stories about what having the building means to your organisation, your business model, your artistic programme, your social mission. What will it enable you to really do? What value, capacity to contribute and social power will you have after the project? And do you know what you want to do with it, with whom you wish to share it, and what you want to achieve? Will the skills, the capacities, the strengths that you and your organisation have now be sufficient when the project is finished? Will you be the same organisation? TLDR, as my niece would say, you won't be, as Stuart has pointed out. Will making the business model work compromise your artistic vision? Might the artistic vision put off some of the physical virtual communities you've already nurtured? So of course, these two poles are connected, they are inseparable. But I think I learned in the process of taking forward our project that anyone, any organisation and its governing body has to negotiate telling a story that moves between these two poles, and that the story you tell has to be able to cope with gradual and sudden changes in the conditions around you at each pole. So you might, like I did, encounter an objector to your scheme who chose to publish details of your salary and career to a dedicated website, who took hand-delivered letters to my chair's home on a Sunday, or who encouraged, unsuccessfully, local businesses to put up posters protesting about the project. But at the same time, you will find a local resident who's passionate about your art form, who happens to be a trained and practicing architect, and who's prepared to lead a counter movement to speak for you at a planning meeting. You may learn that your ambitions for a particular site are not realistic in a very complicated non-metropolitan market, and that you just can't make your initial fundraising target. However, you will also be lucky if you have stakeholders who back so firmly what you're trying to achieve for a place that they will help you identify an alternative site that ultimately offers so much more for you and your audiences and communities than you ever imagined. What enabled us to plot a course between these two poles of public and private, civic and organisational meaning and stress was having a story that was flexible enough to accommodate the changes we weathered, and relationships strong enough to hear that story change without losing confidence. The story and the teller, your vision and your organisation's capacities, is what will get you through to where you want to be in the end. At which point, of course, you will discover that it's not the end at all, just the start of another long story. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for sharing your story with us, your words of wisdom, and thank you to you all our panelists. Kane, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today for this last session in our current season and the end of the sort of first part of our story. And the second chapter will be resuming again on Tuesday, September the 8th. So all I have to say is thank you to Caroline. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you to Joe.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you to Chris. And
Thanks so much.
And look forward to seeing you again in September.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for sharing your stories and being with us. Take care.